The Roman Empire didn't really fall. It just changed its uniform. When we picture the collapse, we picture barbarians at the gate, some dying emperor, the lights going out across the civilized world. That's the story we've all inherited, and it's mostly a myth. What actually happened is quieter than all of that. Courts sitting locked and empty. Grain warehouses gone silent in a city that used to feed 1 million people. Soldiers still getting paid, except not in imperial coin anymore. They were paid in church silver. Think about September of 590. Rome is down to maybe 30,000 people, rattling around inside a city built for more than 1 million. And the Lombards are camped out outside the gates. There's no army left to speak of. No treasury. Just one man, Gregory, negotiating, feeding people, and actually governing. The church never conquered Rome. It didn't have to. By the time the administration disappeared, the church was already sitting right there, doing the work. And that same movement, power quietly migrating toward whatever still functions, is happening right now. Welcome back to The Roman Pattern. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand, and you can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. If you're new here, the thing to know is that we don't really do dates and battles on this channel. We do autopsies. Every episode, we take a system that failed, and we go in and trace how it actually came apart. Not the myth of it, but the working parts underneath. This one is part of a bigger arc. We've already gone through what the Vatican actually is, how power moves inside that institution, and why it still operates the way it does today. And if you haven't seen that one yet, the link's above. Think of this episode as the companion to it. That video asked what the Vatican is. This one's asking how it got there in the first place. Because the Vatican didn't come to power out of pure spiritual inspiration. It came out of administrative necessity. And that story is probably the most important thing that most people were never taught about the fall of Rome. So let me lay down the baseline first. Rome was never really held together by its armies. It was held together by administration, by roads and tax collectors and provincial governors, by courts, by the grain supply chains that kept the cities fed. It was this vast interconnected bureaucracy that ran on Latin, on written records, on people trained to run it. The real genius of Rome was never the legions. It was all of the paperwork sitting behind the legions. When a governor showed up in a new province, he didn't come alone. He brought a whole staff with him. Scribes and lawyers and grain administrators. The actual working infrastructure of Roman civilization moving into place. And that apparatus ran for more or less continuously for something like 600 years. Then it started to come apart from the inside, and not all at once. That's the part the myth always gets wrong. The idea that Rome fell on a specific date. It didn't fall. It eroded slowly, along a few different lines at the same time. The money went first. You get this currency crisis in the 3rd century, where emperors are debasing the silver coinage just to keep paying the soldiers. And that quietly wrecks the financial coherence of the whole empire. This is basically Peter Heather's whole argument about how Rome came apart. That the entire system ran on tax revenue funding the army. So the moment the financial base cracked, everything downstream of it cracked too. The coins lost their silver. Tax revenue collapsed in real terms. And the provinces slowly stopped trusting the center. Then the borders started to give. You get the foederati, barbarian soldiers hired to defend the Roman frontier, gradually filling all the roles that actual Roman citizens didn't want anymore. Until by the year 400, the legions really aren't Roman in any meaningful sense. And then power itself came apart. After 395, the emperors in the West are more and more just symbols. The real power ends up sitting with generals, men like Stilicho, who is half Vandal, or Ricimer, who is Suevic, Visigothic by blood, or Aetius, the one who actually called the last of the Romans. Outsiders and insiders both, and none of them the emperor. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was basically a teenager. He got deposed in 476 by a barbarian general named Odoacer, who didn't even bother replacing him. He just shipped the imperial regalia off to Constantinople and declared the whole position unnecessary. And that's the official end of the Western Empire, the year 476. But here's what actually matters. The administration didn't stop that day. The courts kept running. The grain kept moving. The records kept getting written. It was just being done by somebody other than imperial officials now. To understand how the church ends up inheriting the empire, you have to see how deep it had already grown inside the empire first. Start in 313 with the Edict of Milan. Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius put out this joint declaration. And the headline everybody knows is simple enough. Christianity is now legal. We actually have the text of it. And by the way, because Licinius was writing right around the same time and preserved the wording, which is how we know what it really said. But the interesting part isn't the legalization itself. Constantine didn't just make Christianity legal, he integrated it. Church property gets restored. The clergy gets exempted from civic duties and from taxes. And within a few years, bishops are being granted the authority to act as judges in actual civil cases. Sit with that for a second. Bishops sitting as civil judges. And this is still in the early 300s. The church has been legal for almost no time at all. And Constantine is already threading bishops into the administrative structure of the state. And you have to ask why he'd do that. And the honest answer is power. The 3rd century crisis had shredded whatever confidence the Roman population still had in the imperial system. The currency was debased. The military was unreliable. And the emperors were getting murdered at the rate of something like 1 every 2 years. People needed something they could actually trust. And the church had spent 2 centuries quietly building exactly that. All through the persecutions, it had run its own networks to feed its members, bury its dead, look after imprisoned clergy. It had basically built a working shadow welfare state, and it knew how to run logistics. Constantine saw that clearly. He didn't just tolerate the church, he put it to use. Then you get Theodosius. In 380, the Edict of Thessalonica makes Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the empire. And then in 391, Theodosius bans pagan worship outright and closes the temples. In that moment, the church stopped being a useful partner to the imperial system and becomes its spiritual arm. And then something else happens. Something that on the surface looks administrative and honestly kind of boring. But it turns out to be the most consequential move of the whole period. The empire was organized geographically into provinces. Each province had a governor. Each governor had a staff. And that staff handled taxation, law, defense coordination, and the grain supply. All of it. Then those provinces got grouped into bigger administrative units. And here's a word you'll recognize. They were called dioceses, run by officials called vicarii. That's the Roman administrative skeleton, basically. Now watch what the church does with it. When it starts formally organizing itself in the 4th century, it doesn't go invent some new geography. It just adopts the one that's already there. Almost exactly. Every major Roman city that had been a provincial capital ends up with a bishop. The church's boundaries, its dioceses, map right onto the old Roman provincial boundaries. Even the word diocese is Roman, lifted straight out of the imperial administrative vocabulary. And none of that was an accident. It was rational design. The early church understood something simple, that if you want to run an institution across the same territory that Rome ran, use the same grid that Rome used. Same roads, same population centers, same underlying logic. And then the Western Empire starts to fail. The provincial governors lose their funding, their staff shrink, and the judicial and administrative work those provinces had done for centuries, well, that just starts going undone. So across the 4th and 5th centuries, city by city, the bishop steps into the gap. Not because bishops were sitting around planning to govern, but because somebody had to do it, and they were the ones still standing there. So let me be precise about what bishops were actually doing by the year 400. For one thing, they were running courts. When the imperial judicial system broke down, when the provincial governor was absent or corrupt or just gone, people started bringing their disputes to bishops instead. The church had its own legal apparatus by then, canon law, and bishops had a kind of legitimacy that imperial officials were steadily losing. They were local, they were known, and they fed people. That last part matters more than it sounds like it should. One of the core functions of Roman provincial administration had always been the grain supply. The annona, the grain dole, was how Rome kept its urban populations from coming apart. So when the financial crisis hit and the imperial supply chains broke down, the bishop used church estates to fill the gap. The land had been piling up since Constantine, tax-exempt, donated by wealthy converts. Until 400, the church in the major western cities controlled serious agricultural territory. The territory produced grain, and the bishops were the ones handing it out. This is where the money problem basically flips. The imperial financial system is collapsing, debased coinage, broken supply chains, administrators going unpaid, while the church's financial system is getting stronger the whole time, sitting outside the inflation, accumulating land and silver, quietly building a parallel treasury. So by the time the Western Empire actually ends, the church has moral authority and real economic infrastructure sitting behind it. Ambrose of Milan gives you an early taste of where this goes. He's the bishop of one of the most important cities in the West, and he's negotiating directly with emperors. In 390, after the massacre at Thessalonica, he's barred the emperor Theodosius from communion and forced him into a public act of penance. We know the details because Ambrose wrote about it himself. His own letters describing a bishop bringing the single most powerful man in the world to heel. A bishop, forcing the emperor of Rome down to his knees. Strip the religious language off that, and what's left is a raw institutional power. And the church's authority was already going toe-to-toe with the empires, more than 80 years before the West officially ends. So what you're watching isn't a sudden handoff. It's a slow, steady migration of function out of a system that was failing and onto one that wasn't. There's a piece of this that never really gets enough attention, and that's the monasteries. We tend to think of them as places where men went to retreat from the world, and sure, that's true as far as it goes. But they were also doing something else entirely. They were the backup drives. Think about everything that lived inside a functioning Roman administration. Legal codes, agricultural manuals, engineering texts, census records, diplomatic correspondence. Basically the operating instructions for running an entire civilization. All of it written in Latin, and all of it stored in specific physical places. And as the Western Empire fragmented, those places, the imperial archives and the provincial libraries, turned into targets. They got burned, looted, abandoned. The monasteries are where whatever survived actually survived. Benedict of Nursia, who founded his monastery at Monte Cassino around 529, wrote a daily requirement for reading straight into his rule. Every monk was expected to read. Every monastery had a scriptorium, and every scriptorium was copying text. And not only religious ones, agricultural manuals, medical texts, Roman administrative procedure, all of it getting copied. On the surface, it looks passive, just monks copying old books. But what they were really preserving was the institutional memory of how you run a complex system. And they were doing it in Latin, which matters more than it sounds. Latin as an administrative language was the connective tissue of the whole Roman world. It's what let a governor up in Britannia communicate with a procurator down in Africa. It's what let a court in Hispania read and apply laws that were written in Rome. When the barbarian kingdoms broke the West apart, they brought their own vernaculars with them, Frankish and Gothic and Burgundian. And the church is the thing that kept Latin alive through all of it. Not as a street language, that was already dying, but as the language of administration, of law and diplomacy and theology. Any barbarian king who actually wanted to govern well needed people who could read Latin, and those people were coming out of the monasteries and the cathedral schools. trained by the Church, working inside a Roman framework, long after Rome itself was gone. Now we get to Gregory, and this is where the whole thing becomes hard to argue with. Gregory was born around 540 into one of Rome's old senatorial families, the kind of family that already produced popes before him. He got the classical Roman education, law and rhetoric and administration, and he served as prefect of Rome, which was the highest civil administrative job in the city. Before he was even 35, he knew how Rome worked. Not the Rome of the Caesars. That world was already finished. But the administrative Rome, the Rome of tax codes and legal precedent and bureaucratic procedure. That knowledge was in him, and when he became pope in 590, he put it to work. So let me give you the situation that he walked into, because Rome at this point was a wreck. The Justinianic Wars, the Byzantine attempt to reconquer Italy back from the Ostrogoths, had already dragged on for 20 years and done more damage to Italy than the Goths ever managed. Our best witness for that is Procopius, who actually served on the Byzantine side during those campaigns and wrote them down firsthand. And the Italy he leaves you with is a country wrecked by the very war that was supposed to save it. Then the plague hits. The plague of Justinian rolls through the Mediterranean across the 540s and into the 560s. And Procopius lived through that one too. And his description of the bodies piling up in Constantinople is part of how we grasp just how total the collapse really was. Rome's population caves in. And now, on top of all of that, the Lombards, a Germanic people who'd come down into Italy in 568. And they weren't Romanized or Catholic, and they weren't playing by the old rules. On paper, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople was still the ruler of Rome, but his actual representative in Italy, the exarch, is sitting up in Ravenna, several days' travel away. So when the Lombards turn up at Rome's gates, Gregory sends his urgent message off to Constantinople asking for troops, for money, for any help of any kind. And the response he gets back is slow, then inadequate, then eventually nothing at all. Gregory didn't wait around for it. He opened the church treasury and paid the soldiers defending the city himself. Not with imperial coin, because there wasn't any, but with church silver. He organized the food supply out of church estates down in Sicily, opened the church granaries, and sent his own people, not bishops doing theology, but deacons doing logistics, out to manage supply lines across the region. And then he sat down and negotiated directly with the Lombard king, a pope, running foreign policy. On behalf of the city, the empire simply couldn't protect anymore. Nobody had given Gregory permission to do any of this. There was no formal transfer of authority, no ceremony, no document that made it official. He just did what the situation in front of him required, and what it required was somebody to govern Rome. The empire couldn't do it anymore, and the church could. By the time Gregory died in 604, the papacy had picked up, out of sheer necessity, basically every core function of imperial government: defense, feeding the city, settling legal disputes, handling the relations with neighboring powers. That's the power line finishing its migration. And it didn't happen through conquest or revolution. It happened through vacancy. The imperial administration just left an opening, and the church, which had already been sitting inside that space for centuries, simply moved into it. Here's the part of the story that most people miss. When these barbarian kings took over the old provinces of the Western Empire, they ran straight into a serious problem. They could conquer the territory just fine. What they couldn't do was govern it. The people they were now trying to rule still thought of themselves as Romans. They spoke Latin dialects. They were organized around Roman civic structures. They had their bishops. They carried a whole Christian worldview that centuries of Roman Christianity had shaped. And their new kings were outsiders to all of it, culturally and administratively and religiously. Take Clovis, the king of the Franks. He conquers Roman Gaul across the 480s and 490s. And then around the turn of the century, he converts. And specifically, he converts to Catholic Christianity, which is not the Arian Christianity of the most of the other Germanic kingdoms had taken up. He takes the same version as Rome, and that distinction is the whole game. Because the bishops of Gaul The men actually running the cities and managing the food and administering the courts and training those administrators were Catholic. So when Clovis converts, he isn't just changing his personal religion, he's getting access to the entire administrative network the church had spent 2 centuries building inside the Roman system. And the bishops respond exactly the way you'd expect. They recognize him as a legitimate ruler. They cooperate with his administration. They hand him literate administrators trained in Latin and Roman law and record keeping. They legitimize his taxation. They back his legal claims. And that's the border problem starting to resolve itself. Barbarian kings had shattered the old Roman borders, and that left this destabilizing question hanging in the air, which is, who are we now? And the church already had an answer. You're a Christian. Christian identity just quietly overrode ethnic identity. Frankish or Roman, it stopped mattering. Because you were Catholic, you were inside the same civilizational framework as everyone else. The old borders broke, and the church drew new ones. Except the new ones weren't geographic, they were doctrinal, and those turned out to be far more durable than Roman lines ever were. Clovis is just the clearest case, but the same thing repeats. The Visigoths in Hispania, the Burgundians, eventually the Lombards themselves. Every time, the move to Catholic Christianity was also a move toward access. Access to Roman administrative networks the church had kept alive. And every time it was the same exchange. Legitimacy for continuity. You recognize us, we run your administration. Both sides walked away with what they needed. The Roman system got to keep living inside the church, and the barbarian kingdoms became something you could actually govern. By around the year 700, here's the picture. The Western Roman Empire as a political entity is gone, and it's been for over 200 years. But look at the administrative apparatus that's still standing. Latin is still the language of law and administration across the whole former empire. The diocese system is still organizing the geography of governance. Bishops are still functioning as civic administrators in the most of the major cities. The monasteries are still training administrators and preserving records and running agricultural networks. And the Pope in Rome is still doing foreign policy, receiving ambassadors, negotiating with kings, issuing binding legal judgments across an entire civilization. Strip the religious vocabulary off all of that and look at the structure underneath. And the structure is Roman. Now, I want to be fair to the other side of this argument. Brian Ward Perkins makes the case that the fall of Rome was a genuine catastrophe. And a real collapse in a material civilization is not just a change of management. And on the physical world, he's absolutely right. The aqueducts, the trade networks, the mass-produced pottery, the basic standard of living, all of that really did fall off a cliff. What I'm saying survived is something narrower than that. It's the administrative logic. And that's the piece that migrated instead of dying. You can see it everywhere once you start looking. The basilica, the architectural form of Christian worship, is literally the Roman basilica, the same kind of building that Roman magistrates used to hold court and conduct public business, just repurposed and renamed and running the same functions as before. The Roman administrative vocabulary is still living inside the church too. There's diocese, and parish, and pontiff, which comes from pontifex, the Roman title for a high priest and a bridge builder, and cardinal, which comes from the Latin cardo, meaning a hinge. The church didn't borrow all the Roman language for decoration. It borrowed it because it was running Roman functions and needed the Roman words for what they did, which leads to a line that's genuinely hard to get around. The longest-lived Roman institution on earth is the Catholic Church, and it's still running today. And if you look at how it's actually built, it's still Roman in a very literal way. When historians argue about the fall of Rome, most of the time what they're really arguing about is the fall of the political form, the emperors and the army and the visible machinery of conquest and control. That part genuinely fell. What didn't fall was the administrative substance underneath it, the network of trained administrators, the geographic infrastructure of governance, the economic engine of church estates and Latin record keeping, the whole institutional memory of how you actually run a complex civilization across a huge territory. That didn't disappear anywhere. It just changed its uniform. So here's the through line that I want you to hold on to, because it's bigger than Rome. Political forms are temporary. Empires rise and empires fall. Republics harden into autocracies. Autocracies turn into something else again. The political form, the flag and the emperor's face on the coin and the official name of the state, is really just the surface layer, and it's the least durable part of any civilization there is. What actually lasts is the institutional substance underneath it. The trained administrators, the legal frameworks, the geographic networks, the working procedures that let a complex society function at all. That stuff doesn't vanish when the political form changes. It migrates instead. Attaching itself to whatever institution can still do the core things. Feeding people, settle their disputes, manage resources, keep records, and either defend the community or at least negotiate its safety. In 590, the church could do all of that, and the empire simply couldn't. So the substance moved to the church. And this isn't some one-off movement in history. It's closer to a rule. Every time a dominant political form collapses, you see the same thing happen underneath it. The substance doesn't evaporate. It goes looking for a new container. Sometimes that container is obvious. An institution that's already there with parallel capabilities. The way the church was. Sometimes it's much harder to see coming. But the migration happens either way. The real question was never whether the substance survives the form, because it usually does. The question is which institution catches it. Which organization is already quietly doing the core work at the moment the old one gives out? Because that's the one that ends up inheriting the civilization. So let me say the next part plainly. We all live inside institutions, and most of us go through our whole lives barely thinking about them. We use the dollar. We operate inside legal systems. We lean on supply chains and communication infrastructure and educational frameworks. And every one of those is maintained by some specific institution with its own long administrative history. And most of those institutions are a lot older than they look, running on frameworks they borrowed from something that came before them. Look at Western legal systems, for instance. They don't just draw inspiration from Roman law. They're actually running on Roman law. The Justinian Code, which got compiled in Constantinople back in the 530s, then preserved inside church institutions, then rediscovered and taught again in the 11th century, became the foundation of European civil law. A Roman emperor, dead for 1,000 years, is still governing property rights and contract law in Western courts today. Or look at the university. The first European universities grew straight out of cathedral schools, organized by bishops, running on church administrative frameworks and older Roman educational traditions. And then the 7 liberal arts, which were the classical Roman curriculum, are still recognizable in the way Western education organizes itself right now. So the pattern runs forward, and not just into the medieval church, but all the way to now. Every time a dominant political order has come under real strain, whether that's war or currency crisis or collapse of legitimacy, the same question surfaces. Which institutions are doing the core work? And which ones are carrying the administrative substance that outlasts the political turbulence? Those are the ones that end up inheriting whatever order comes next. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you which institution does that today. That part's your analysis to run, not mine. But I'll give you the framework to run with. The church didn't inherit Rome because it was powerful. It inherited Rome because it was functional. It was feeding people, running the courts, training administrators, keeping the supply lines open, all while the empire was losing its ability to do any of those things at all. And when you ask what it actually carried, the answer is functionality. The church could still feed people and settle disputes and keep the grain moving. And in a collapsing world, that plain competence mattered more than any amount of theology or ideology or even military strength or prestige. The institution that can still do the basic things is the one that survives. And that's the one that inherits. Same pattern, just a different century. So the Roman Empire didn't really fall. It changed its uniform. And the uniform it changed into is still being worn today. The next time you see a bishop presiding over a diocese, understand that you're looking at a Roman provincial governor. The next time you see a papal document written in Latin, you're reading Roman administrative procedure. And the next time a religious institution feeds a city that a government can't, you're basically watching 590 happen all over again. The substance keeps surviving while its forms keep changing. And that's the thread this whole channel keeps pulling on. If you haven't watched the Vatican Companion yet, well, that's the one that covers what the institution eventually became, where this one covered how it's got there in the first place. And together, they're the full autopsy, so that link's above. If this is your first time here on the Roman Pattern, well, this channel exists to find the repeating mechanics, the civilizational fault lines that keep generating the same failures across different empires and different centuries and different uniforms. If that's the kind of thing you're here for, well, go ahead and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Do me a favor, like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want more of The Roman Pattern.